Okay, let's take another story. Isaiah. That was Moses at the end of his pastoral ministry. This is Isaiah at the beginning of his. We're giving this stirring story, which I'm sure you've preached many times in your life, the story of his call in the temple. The temple's filled with smoke, this dramatic cherubim flying, singing, holy, holy, holy. Angel consecrating his mouth to preach the gospel, smoke, fire, movement. It's one of these unimaginable, I mean literally to me unimaginable scenes. It's just everything. And then God's call, who will go? And Isaiah's obedient, I'll go. Send me. Now I can't remember a thing about my ordination. Can't remember the sermon. I remember the place. It was West Park Presbyterian Church in New York City. But it's just one big, I would have remembered this. You're not going to forget this. I mean, none of us have ever had an ordination service like this. But then, listen, this is the part. I bet you've preached on the first part, but I wonder how many of you have preached on this second part. God says, go and tell this people. Now remember, this is an ordination sermon. This is the beginning. You got your whole life stretched out ahead of you. Listen. Tell this people, listen hard, but you aren't going to get it. Look hard, but you won't catch on. Make these people blockheads with fingers in their ears and blindfolds in their eyes. Astonished, I said, and Master, how long is this going to go on? He said, until the cities are emptied out, not a soul left in the cities. Houses empty of people, countryside empty of people. This country will look like a pine and oak forest with every tree cut down. Every tree a stump. A huge field of stumps. But there's a holy seed in those stumps. Just look around you, all these great redwoods. This is how you start out. And God says to you, don't enjoy them too long. They're going to end up stumps. That's the result of your ministry. A bunch of stumps. This whole place clear-cut. But there's a holy seed in those stumps. Well, thanks a lot. That's what I've got to look forward to. I can't imagine Moses leaving that ordination service with a spring in his step. I mean, I don't know how long he lived, but a year would have been too long. Moses and Isaiah, we look back at those two as the giants of our past. These are the people who teach us how to preach, how to lead, how to live into this glorious gospel that comes to fruition and completeness in Jesus Christ and then gets continued on in our lives. And these are the ones that we learn what it's going to be like to live proclaiming that gospel. Moses a failure as he wrapped up his life as a pastor. Isaiah as a failure from the first day of his life as a pastor. If we're going to maintain our identity as Spirit-formed, God-called pastors, we've got to take these stories seriously and not succumb to the kind of illusionary lies that our culture weaves around us of what it means to be successful in this society. Now, we don't think of either Moses or Isaiah as failures, do we? They're not failures. But if we measure them against the expectations that our culture builds into us of what it means to be significant, meaningful, purposeful, forget it. I've got one other prophet. I don't often find contemporary prophets who can be spoken in the same context as Moses and Isaiah, but I think I've got one. Wendell Berry. I'm going to read you his poem, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front. This is the same tone as the Moses story and the Isaiah story. But it's a little more hopeful. Not hopeful in the conditions it portrays, but we've had 2,000 years of Christian experience now. And Wendell Berry knows that and lives that. So before I go to Luke, I'll just use Wendell Berry as a preface. Love the quick profit, the annual raise, vacation with pay. Want more of everything ready-made. Be afraid to know your neighbors and to die. And you will have a window in your head. Not even your future will be a mystery anymore. Your mind will be punched in a card and shut away in a little drawer. When they want you to buy something, they will call you. When they want you to die for profit, they will let you know. So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it, denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance. For what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, so that you will not live to harvest. Say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mold. Call that profit. Prophesy such returns. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Listen to carrion. Put your ear close and hear the faint chattering of the songs that are to come. Expect the end of the world. Laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful though you have considered all the facts. So long as women do not go cheap for power, please women more than men. Ask yourself, will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? Will this disturb the sleep of a woman near to giving birth? Go with your love to the fields. Lie easy in the shade. Rest your head in her lap. Swear allegiance to what is nighest your thoughts. As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the way you didn't go. Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. We still have some prophets, and we're enlisted among them, and let's not settle for anything less. My son is a novelist And the title of his first novel is from this poem, Plant Sequoias. I love that. I hope it gets published one day. Okay. St. Matthew shaping us into Semites. St. Mark shaping us into participants. St. Luke shaping us into Catholics. I grew up in a ghetto. I hated Catholics. I was suspicious of Presbyterians, wary of Lutherans, but Catholics, they were the ones. I lived in a small town, and we were a whole lot of people, and the only Christians were the Pentecostals who spoke in tongues. Everybody else was somewhere outside that ghetto boundary. I walked to school every day past the Catholic Church and always walked on the other side of the street because I knew that in the basement of St. Matthew's Catholic Church in Kalispell, Montana, the place was just filled with machine guns. And there was a Catholic school right next door, and the nuns would sometimes be out with their long dresses, black, and their cowls, whatever those things are. Wimples, aren't those wonderful things? And every one of them had a machine gun under her dress. They were all waiting, just poised, word from the Pope, giving the signal to just slaughter us all. Now, I really believed that, and my Pentecostal friends really believed that, and we didn't make it up. We had evangelists who would come through 2 or 3 times a year and tell us all of this stuff. They'd seen it. They'd been in those places, and they'd seen the guns, the grenades, the mortars, all that stuff down there. And we believed it. St. Luke wrote his gospel for kids like me. To get me out of the ghetto. To get me into the world that God created and that God saved. And he wrote it with enormous skill. You hardly know what he's doing. I mean, he's one of these writers who draws you in, and before you know it, your perceptions no longer are the same. You have images now that subvert all that ghetto talk, that closed in, that claustrophobic, suffocating world of me and others, insiders and outsiders. Many of you did not grow up in quite as sectarian a world as I did, but some of you did. There's something about the gospel, or religion, maybe I should say. There's something about religion when it goes bad, when it just starts to get a little bit distorted or infected, or it becomes everything that was supposed to go outside comes inside. And instead of liberating us, it just suffocates us, brings us tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's the same energies, actually. They're just going the wrong direction. And Luke takes these energies of the gospel and to an already sectarian world that the first century was a very sectarian world. Everybody had their own little club. Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees, Herodians, the Greek mysteries, the Zealots, and that's, do you know, there were 128 different zealot groups. I mean, they weren't just zealots. The zealots hated each other. And if things got bad enough, they'd join up together, but as soon as the hostilities went down, they kind of reverted to their old ways, and the Pharisees were that way. I think the Sadducees they were fat cats, and so as long as they had plenty of money in the bank, they were nice to each other. The first thing I want to note, I'm telling you stuff you know. You know all this stuff. But in some ways I'm just apologetic about telling you stuff you know, except I think the one thing that we don't have in common, just, across the board, is we don't see the shaping power of this. And I want to just retell or remind you of what's going on in these Gospels by their shaping power, their formative power. They're not just texts to teach morals or truth or theology. They get inside us and do something to us. I was in a prayer group a few years ago with some friends, and one of them was a biblical scholar of some repute. And we'd meet every Sunday night for prayer. And we would talk a little bit, and then maybe for 20 minutes or so, then we'd pray for 40 minutes. Well, I was going on about something. I have no idea what it was right now, except it was something that I was excited about. Something in Scripture, I think. And my friend says, "Well, that sounds really good, Eugene, but give me a text for it." I couldn't think of a text for it. But it came out of the Bible. It was the biblical story. And I was participating in this story. But, a text, I needed text. And he said, "Well, I'm sorry. I just can't go along with you." Well, later on, actually, I found a text. If you look long enough, you can find one. But the thing that's kind of surprised me and stumped me at the moment is that it really was evangelical gospel that I was expressing. But without a footnoted text, it wasn't legitimate for my friend. He was a biblical scholar, and he had to have the footnotes. And if I couldn't supply a footnote, what I was talking about was discredited. Now that's a little extreme example, but I don't think it's an extreme mentality that these Gospels, I miss the sense that these Gospels are formative for the way we live. And we've fragmented this Bible into so many verses and subtexts and cross-references that we've missed this glorious story, and it's the story that shaped those early communities and have continued shaping them ever since. But I think something we can recapture here. Anyway, I was apologizing for telling you that Luke wrote 2 volumes. So you need me to tell you that. The Gospel and the Acts. What that means is that we've got a Jesus Torah now. We've got 5 books of Moses and we've got 5 books of Jesus, because Luke was generous enough to have a second volume. Both of these books are about the same length. They both begin addressed to Theophilus, who may or may not have been a real person. It's a little suspicious when somebody's named Theophilus, a God lover. Sounds more like a generic title to me, but it could have been an individual. And they're symmetrical. um, they both, Luke, the gospel begins and the Acts ends on a world stage, Rome. So Luke begins with world history, as big a stage as he can get, and then it just moves down to one point, Jerusalem, and then the crucifixion, the resurrection, and then Acts begins in the same place in Jerusalem, and then moves just about the same pace, widening out until it ends up finally in Rome, with Paul imprisoned in Rome. So we've got this, let me just put that aside for a minute, and I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. One of the characteristic things is, maybe the characteristic thing in Luke is what many people call the outsider theme. We've got this new life, this good news. Christ died, rose again, and Christ is God among us. This revolutionary fact, not just truth, but fact. There's something objective, solid about this. Now, and you're living in this world where, we're all members of different clubs, sects, afraid of each other, suspicious of each other. Who belongs? Who gets in? Well, you'd think by this time, we've got 2,000 years of history. You've got Isaiah preaching the gospel, the light to all the nations, and a lot of stuff like that going on in our history. But you wouldn't think it would be a problem, would you? Until you look at your congregation, look at your community, look at the Presbyterians. Who belongs? Well, Luke, instead of just saying everybody belongs, he just patiently starts to pull people in that you wouldn't have expected. The first big division, of course, was because Jews and Gentiles, difference between the Jews and Gentiles, and just a reminder of chronology here. Paul had been converted and had been preaching for probably 20 years before any of the Gospels were written. Maybe not 20, maybe could be as little as 10 or 15, but as my dad used to say, don't bother me with those details. It's good enough for government work. Paul has been well established for a number of years, preaching before any of the Gospels were written, and Luke was his companion. So just as Mark was, in a sense, Peter's amanuensis or writer or ghostwriter, Luke was Paul's. And Luke comes from the Gentile world himself, but Paul was the one who broke the barriers and opened the awareness of people, worked through all the fears of people, those early Christians, to the Gentile world. But there's more than just Jews and Gentiles in this. Paul, in a sense, is the first outsider to break into, or the first person to break out of this insiderness and join the outsiders. And in Paul, for the first time, the gospel becomes obviously for the world. And Paul's traveled. The Jewish persecution beginning in Jerusalem started spreading them out. But they still stayed in their ghettos. They still stayed in synagogues. They're little clusters of people, and Paul was the one who broke that out, and Luke is the one who tells the story, except he doesn't just tell the story of Paul. He goes back and starts with Jesus, and he starts telling that story step by step by step. And we're going to take a break now and then come back, and I will continue